that marketing has become an instrument of social control. So I guess kind of the point of what I was trying to say yesterday is that when we start to think about marketing, when we start to think about commercialization, that we have to recognize that these are forms of social control, that they are also forms of social construction and social formation. So in other words, something like Facebook is not merely a tool, it's not merely a thing that we do, it is one of the constituents of contemporary reality. So in order to understand contemporary reality, we have to look at the things that contribute to its construction, to its formation, to its transformation, and clearly digital technology is part of that, but more importantly, marketing. Okay, so one of the books I was talking about yesterday is called The Attention Merchants, and it's a really interesting book because it's basically the history of advertising and the ways by which government, for example, has begun to use advertising. But what's really interesting about that historically is that advertising is comparatively recent as an invention. Okay, it's only within the last 150 years that we've really had mass advertising, and it's less than a century since governments started advertising. So war recruitment during the First World War was the first time that government had decided to use advertising in order to build a profile and gain attention. So when we think of campaigns now like Trump getting elected or whatever, we think that politics has always been about advertising, has always been about brand image and so forth. But that is actually not true. For every period in history up until the last century, that was not true. Government did not get elected on the basis of advertising. It got elected on the basis of popular rallies, notions of conviction, and so on. So one of the things that's really interesting to try to think about with respect to Facebook, for example, is think about that like button, which billions of people are clicking billions of times every day. But what does it actually mean to sort of think about our society and its formation in terms of whether or not you like something? Okay, and just how dominant this idea of liking something has become within social formations, to the point where people actively solicit it, that they put up pictures on Facebook and kind of sit around thinking, well, that didn't get very many likes, there must be something wrong with me, or there's something wrong with the universe. But the point is that this is a formation, right? This is a way by which our desire is being shaped, it's being channeled, and it becomes the measure of how we think about our place within society. And in other words, the reason Trump got elected, at least in part, was because he understood perhaps far better than Hillary did that function, that like function, that fame, attention, and so forth, is one of the crucial kind of factors of contemporary life. Okay, in other words, what that tends to suggest is that Trump is very far from being the last type reality TV type president to get elected. He's certainly the first, but he's unlikely to be the last. And if you think about what's likely to follow Trump, one may suppose it could be, in fact, more of the same, or an intensification of the same, and that we're likely to see the same thing spread throughout the world. Now, one of the other things that Deleuze talks about in this particular essay is he puts forward the idea that man is no longer confined, but now man is in debt, and that debt is one of the most potent control instruments of the 21st century. It's interesting, David Graeber has a book called Debt, the First 5,000 Years, which is a quite terrifically interesting book, except for one thing, that he doesn't seem to have got Deleuze at all right, and I do wonder whether he spent more than 5 minutes trying to get it right. So if we just kind of delete his stupid remarks about Deleuze, it's actually quite an interesting book. But one of the things that he's trying to show is that debt cannot be thought of as a purely financial instrument, that debt has always been a social instrument. Okay, And not all societies deal with debt in the same way, and in fact not all societies have debt. And what's really interesting is that if you think about Western society, for most of the history of the West within Europe and so forth, debt was seen as being fundamentally and morally a bad thing. Okay, but nonetheless, it has now become completely dominant, and now debt has become a way not merely of controlling people, but of facilitating all kinds of things that would not be possible in the absence of debt. So Deleuze says control is short-term and rapidly shifting, but at the same time continuous and unbounded, whereas discipline was long-term, infinite, and discontinuous. So in other words, the way by which control now functions, it's moment to moment. Okay, it doesn't make plans, it doesn't think long-term, and it doesn't have to. Okay, it's moment to moment. Mind you, Deleuze says that one thing hasn't changed in that capitalism still keeps 3/4 of humanity in extreme poverty, too poor to have debt and too numerous to be confined. And control, he says, will have to deal not only with the vanishing frontiers, but the mushrooming shanty towns and ghettos and so forth. So, in other words, he's suggesting that the slum formations that are growing around the world as the planet becomes increasingly urbanized actually fall outside of the realm of control. So control is very much a kind of first world, middle class and above kind of formation that doesn't apply directly to the poor people of the planet, but in many ways they are implicated within the regime as well, but they are not necessarily controlled by it. So one of the other things that's really interesting about what Deleuze is trying to suggest then is that a certain sector of the planet, if you like, can and does dominate the rest of the planet and define what is possible for them in some cases, but its form of control is not absolute. So, if we ask the question, where is the revolution likely to come from, then it's probably from within that space outside of control. So the slums are likely to generate the revolution, if it is to happen at all. Now, one of the things he says that I find really fascinating, he says we ought to establish the basic socio-technological principles of control mechanisms as their age dawns, and describe in these terms what is already taking the place of discipline and sites of confinement. So I think, if I was to be able to tell PhD students what they should be writing about, which of course every PhD supervisor fantasizes that they can, but students are the ultimate form of resistance. No, I will write the PhD I want to write, not the PhD you want me to write. I don't care how good your advice is, I'm still going to write the PhD I want to write. Which is, of course, they're right. But if I was able to define their topic for them, or encourage them, with a cattle prod or something to do this topic, it would be this idea of trying to understand the socio-technological principles of control of the 21st century. To begin to see that what's really interesting about our era is that control comes to us in a form that does not look like control. So when you look at what Foucault was talking about, putting people in prison, confining them in schools, forcing them to sit in a particular kind of a way, the kinds of things that he was describing then are really, really visible, and visible as what they are, namely forms of control. But Facebook seems like, the most awesome social bit of fun that has ever been invented, and so it does not look like what in fact it is, which is a mode of control. So what's fascinating about our period is that the most powerful forms of social control do not appear to be social control, and in fact we solicit them, we want them. Okay, and I think for us that's a historically new kind of a period, that we have entered a realm in which we don't see control as something to rise up against, but rather we see control as something that we ask for more of it. Can I have some more control, please? Could you please survey me some more? Please have some more of my data. And, these are the things which define the 21st century. And he says, it is the job of young people to discover whose ends these serve. So whose ends do these socio-technological principles of control, whose ends do they serve? And I guess I would want to suggest that there is no more urgent question today. Now, as I've often said, we only have to look at Facebook's business model to see that our interest in using social media actually amounts to free labor for that organization. Thus, our interest in it furthers its interests. Every time we use Google to look something up, our interest in finding something furthers the interest of the corporate entity that is Google. But as Deleuze says, the question here is to say how our freedom and slavery is played out in this new regime. Okay, so that concludes the section that I wanted to talk about with respect to Deleuze's essay on societies of control. And I'll move now on to a second topic, if you like, but related to it and still under the general theme of connected lives. And this is to look at the work of Jonathan Crary and a book that he wrote a couple of years ago called 24/7. For the Foucauldians in the room, you may recognize Crary as one of the, I think, leading Foucauldian scholars of recent times. And certainly he has written some really, a couple of really important books on Foucault, and particularly on the notion of the panopticon. Now this particular book, which is quite a small book, but nonetheless a very important and quite powerful book, wants to ask the question about what is the place of sleep in the 21st century? And what is the place of leisure and so on? Now you might think this is kind of a peculiar topic to want to write a book about, but if you follow the thread of what I was trying to say yesterday, one of the things that is happening with digital culture, the digital economy, is that our attention is being colonized, captured, harvested, commodified, monetized. But that means that our attention has to be directed to and captured by a particular kind of a device. And so if you follow the logic through, every time you turn off your phone, because you want to go to sleep, that's 6 or 7 hours worth of, advertising commodity time that is just being wasted. Okay, like the ultimate for a corporation like Facebook would be for you to be looking at your screen 24 hours a day. Okay, so they don't want you to sleep. I mean, there's no commercial interest in you sleeping. And already, if you look at some of the recent research around sleep, ironically enough, the leading cause of sleeplessness is too much time looking at your screen. And one of the first things that they advise people who are having difficulty sleeping is to not look at their screen so much, and particularly to not look at it just before you go to bed. Okay, so there's all this sort of sleep advice which says put your phone away, don't look at it before you go to bed, which of course most people only read about whilst they're in bed looking at their phone. Oh, I shouldn't be looking at my phone. What, damn it. So like most forms of advice, it's usually ignored. Okay, so Crary's book 24/7 aims to transform this commonplace phrase 24/7 into a concept as a way of talking about and defining what he wants to call the tempo and the mood of the 21st century. So in other words, he wants to make it into a zeitgeist term. Zeitgeist literally means, the German word, literally meaning the spirit of the times. So 24/7, he says, we have 24/7 markets, we have 24/7 global infrastructure, for example, airports. I believe the airports in India are all 24/7, right? Certainly I've never been anywhere else in the world where, arriving for a flight or to take off for a flight at 2 a.m. is considered a perfectly normal and rational thing to do. But again, there's something about the Indian temporality which is difficult for me to get my head around. But I think it's worth thinking about. Like, Indian time is quite different from Australian time. Like 2 a.m. is a perfectly normal time to catch a plane. In Australia, if you had a flight scheduled for 2 a.m., people would just be like, fuck it, we're not going. It's too late. So, this sense of time and the way by which cultures appreciate time is, I think, something that's worthy of serious consideration. Now, this 24/7 global infrastructure has been in place for at least the last 30 or 40 years. But lately, because of the spread of digital technology, we have begun to live this time more intensely than was previously possible. So 24/7 can then also be understood as an existential concept. It defines our way of thinking about our existence today. So when I was asking the question yesterday, what does it mean to be connected? One of the things I didn't mention, but what I was kind of alluding to, was this sense of temporality. To be connected now is not to be connected in a sort of episodic, haphazard, occasional kind of way. It's to be connected constantly, continuously, without interruption. And the idea that there might be a moment in time when you weren't connected is experienced as something that is kind of horrifying. It fills you with existential dread. If Kierkegaard had a mobile phone, you could just imagine the book he would write. Oh my God, she's not answering my text. It would be the deep, dark night. So we have begun to model our subjective lives and thus our personal and social identity on the uninterrupted operation of markets and of information systems. Machines that don't sleep, and thus neither do we. So Crary argues that 24/7 can, as a consequence, only have the appearance of being a social world. So this is his most, I think, provocative and profound thesis, that in a sense, at the moment in time when we think of ourselves as being the most connected we could ever be, and certainly the most connected we have ever been, that our understanding of what it means to be connected at a social level has completely disintegrated, that we are no longer social in this sense, and that what we have is no longer a social world. Actually, he says, it is a non-social model of machinic performance and a suspension of living that does not disclose the human cost of sustaining it. So the focus on 24/7 disguises the stripping away of concern about the future, he says. And what is new, he argues, is the sweeping abandonment, and I'm quoting here, of the pretense that time is coupled to any long-term undertakings, even to fantasies of progress or development. So one of the really interesting sort of social effects of post-structuralism, and for those of you who are still reading Derrida, despite all the warnings, one of the things that the sort of post-structuralist movement, if you like, did was to destroy any idea that we could reasonably think about the idea of progress. Okay, so progress was always, basically said, well, who says this is progress? Who says things are getting better? Who are you to say that this is progress, etc., etc.? So one of the things we did was to kind of take away this idea that progress was even possible, and progress was something that we could think about, talk about, or describe. But in effect, what Crary is saying is that once we lose this idea of progress, then how do we measure and how do we think about our passage into the future? And can we actually think about a passage into the future? Because without a model of progress, without some idea of the future, then all we have is a perpetual present. Okay, and in many forms of existential thinking, the perpetual present is in fact our definition of hell, the thing that never changes. What could be more hellish than that? So one of the things that I think is important for us to think about today is how do we rescue this idea of the future? How do we rescue this idea of progress? Mindful of all the various critiques, but at the same time saying without it, we are doomed to simply perpetuate the present and not to have some idea of change. So we can say then that 24/7 is becoming the time of indifference. It promotes the idea of ceaseless toil, work without pause or limit, and it decrees absolute availability. So one of the other implications of this idea of being connected is also availability. It means that you are never off the clock. You are never out of touch, never out of reach from your workplace. Okay? No matter where you are in the world, you can answer the phone, you can respond to that email, and people's sense of temporality, of being able to break up their time, is steadily and progressively being eroded, to the point where people, say, look, I'm on holidays right now, I can't answer your email, and that is no longer seen as sort of a reasonable response. So what are you talking about? You're on holidays. There is no such thing. You're at the beach. I don't care. Answer your damn email. So our sense of availability is also at issue with this idea of being connected. And so to be connected is to be forever tethered to your workplace and unable to escape it. And again, think how quickly we have embraced this idea and have willingly made ourselves available in this way by having our mobile phones. I always think of this, there's a story that in the 1970s, Coca-Cola sort of had it as its corporate ambition that there would, no matter where you were in the world, a can of Coke would never be more than 2 meters away. Now, I don't know if they attained that ambition, but most people thought it was kind of, beyond crazy, like how could they hope to attain it? But think about what the mobile phone technology has done. Like 2 meters, are you kidding? It's in my pocket. It's never even 2 meters away. It's much less than 2 meters away. So we have gone, like with mobile phones, we've achieved something that Coca-Cola saw as a wild ambition and succeeded way past anything that Coca-Cola thought was even reasonable. We have our devices with us all the time. We have them set so that if any, minute thing happens in the world, like a little spiderweb, feeling a pulse, it buzzes in our pocket to let us know, quick, you better look at your phone. I don't know what's happened, but something meaningful happened. You haven't looked at your screen for at least, a minute now. You better take a look. There's quite interesting research coming out about just how often do people look at their telephones. So one study that I read recently asked a bunch of American college students how often they looked at their phone. Just as a guess, what do you think the number is? Like, in terms of how many times a day, thinking about your own usage of your phone, how many times a day would you look at your phone? Hands up, 10 times. Okay, so at least we're going to be honest. 20 times. Okay, so now the delusional people are putting their hands up. More than 20 times, let's say 40 times. Yeah, more than 40, okay. What about more than, say, 100 times? Yeah, okay, so the truth is starting to come out. So this particular study claims that American college students in this particular sample looked at their phone on average of 260 times a day. So approximately every 7 minutes. So the question you have to ask yourself is whether or not that's true for you or not. I personally don't believe people who tell me that it's only 20 times a day. I feel that that's definitely delusional. But even if that is true, that's still approximately every 20 or 30 minutes for your whole waking day. So it means that your phone and whatever's buzzing on your phone is actually never very far from your consciousness. And if it gets down to every 7 minutes, then you sort of start to say, well, is there anything else that's in your consciousness? It's like I think it's a joke anyway. They say that teenage boys think about sex approximately every 20 seconds, which may or may not be true. But let's say it is true, then what's left of your consciousness to think about something besides sex? If you're looking at your phone every 7 minutes, then what effect does that have on your ability to concentrate on whatever it is that you're actually doing? And so what does this new, and they call it distraction, but I think distraction is not the right word. I think it's different. It's not distraction. We're talking about fragmentation. Like your time, your consciousness, your attention, the way by which you interact and engage with the world is fragmented. Okay? So what does the world look like through this fragmented lens? Okay? Now, remember that sort of classic Marxism, the goals of classic Marxism was always this idea of totalization. How do we bring the total world into view to fully understand what is going on? If you match that against the kind of fragmented worldview that is the norm now, then you see in a way just how much more urgent that Marxist idea of totalization is becoming, because it's now seemingly impossible to bring this worldview before us, because we live in this sort of completely fragmented way of seeing things. So against this idea of ceaseless toil, sleep has come to seem like stealing time from the capitalist machine, Crary says. And so we feed ourselves coffee and other stimulants in order to defy the body's need for sleep. So there are two people who didn't have enough coffee. Not enough stimulants. But it's an interesting idea, right? Like, coffee is the most widely consumed beverage on the planet. It's kind of steadily overtaking tea. So tea, which is a mild stimulant, but in terms of its cultural use, is mostly thought of in terms of sitting down, relaxing. So that when somebody's really stressed out, you say to them, it's okay, have a cup of tea, settle down and relax, okay? So tea was always a way about taking time back for yourself. But coffee is the absolute opposite, okay? Like, coffee is all about, you don't have time to be asleep, you don't have time for sitting down and relaxing, have a coffee on the go, come on, keep moving, keep moving. So there's this global industry that has grown up around the idea that sleep is bad, being sleepy is even worse, and that you should constantly stimulate yourself into activity, and that the real problem that you face right now is that you haven't had enough coffee. And lack of coffee is seen as a genuine social need, which I personally suffer from. I always say that there's a difference between a coffee snob and a coffee addict. So, like, I know people who are genuine coffee snobs. They'll go into a place and go, "Oh, look, I'm sorry, it's not single source. It's, I won't be able to drink that coffee. It's just not good enough for me." Whereas I'm like the absolute opposite. Like, if you tell me it's coffee, I will drink it. I mean, if it's powdered cardboard and looks like coffee, I'm there. I remember once I was in China staying in a guest house, and they only had coffee sachets, but there was no clean water in the room. So I was like, shit, I can't make coffee. And so out of an act of sheer desperation, I just opened the sachet and just kind of tipped it into my mouth and just sort of crunched up the raw coffee, which now, upon reflection, seems kind of crazy. But it did point to the fact that I was a genuine coffee addict and probably should go through the 12 steps. So coffee then is a social symptom for us, right? It points to this idea that we think being stimulated and being attentive all the time is in fact culturally good. Okay, it's not merely desirable, it's culturally good. And in fact, when people are inattentive, we see them as being somehow culturally problematic. Okay, like, I don't know if that's how it is in India, but certainly in Australia or in the US, if kids have difficulty focusing in class, they get classified as having an attention deficit disorder, and they get given drugs to, basically speed, to make them more focused in class. Okay, so we see now that attention is in fact not merely desirable, but attention is sort of seen as being a required attribute. If you can't focus on things, there is something wrong with you. Okay, never mind that the thing you're focusing on might be really boring or completely irrelevant to you. Like, you're a kid sitting there thinking calculus, never going to use it, don't care. Why should you be attentive to things that are never going to matter to you? You see those fabulous memes, another day gone by, didn't use algebra. For most of us, like particularly in the humanities, that's completely true. I can't begin to count the number of days that I haven't used algebra. It's into the thousands. And yet, for a couple of years during high school, I had to focus on it with a significant amount of attention. So when we're thinking about education, we're not only thinking about learning, but we're also thinking about this idea of attention. You must pay attention. Your whole future depends upon you paying attention right now. So it's a psychological attribute, but a psychological attribute that has been captured by a number of different agencies, from education through employment and also culturally and morally. To be unable to pay attention is to be seen as a moral failure. So Crary says then that sleep, like hunger, like thirst, like sex, and perhaps even friendship, has been commercialized. And in a sense, this has been the major goal of all the digital technology. Every app that is constructed is trying to figure out how can we commercialize every aspect of daily life, so that people have, like, Fitbits, for example, that tell them not only how long did they sleep, but what was the quality of their sleep. Now, I really doubt the validity of that particular data, and yet I have all kinds of friends who say, oh yeah, my Fitbit said I slept really well last night. I'm like, don't you know? Like, you wake up in the morning and think, I feel great, I must have slept okay. Nope, have to check my Fitbit. Yep, Fitbit says I slept awesome. So there is also this kind of way by which we give up on our sense of expertise and of even knowing ourselves. And I don't know if this is even true. I kind of hope that it is, and I think somebody should write a PhD on it. But I read recently, on Facebook of course, that they're now, I don't know if they've done it or they're thinking of doing it, but somehow connecting condoms to Fitbits, so that you'll get like a digital report afterwards of how good your sex was. Like, you know, I don't even know what the data fields are going to be. I guess it'll be, you know, time, frequency, something, I don't know. But the very idea that, like, I mean, who was the design person that sat down and thought, condoms, you know, there's something we should get connected to our Fitbits. You know, I would love to have been in that meeting where they're sitting around saying, yeah, look, it's the untapped market. Everybody wants to know what their performance is. We definitely got to have our condoms connected to Fitbits because people are going to want to know that stuff. They're going to be, like, can you imagine, like, just a scenario, you're sort of, you know, having this marvelous intimate moment, and then both of you roll over and check your phones. Like, you don't even smoke a cigarette, you're checking your phone. Personal best, you know, you can just see it. I mean, it's, the mind boggles. And I really hope that's not where things are going. But as you think about, you know, the ways by which digital technology is capturing, if it captures even our most intimate moments, then what does that say about us? Maybe it's the end of civilization, I don't know. So it has been drawn into the discourse of wellness, of self-care, and interesting enough, as I said before, the principal cure for sleep problems is to work less and to opt out of the 24/7 mode of constant stimulation. So the infinite expansion of work overturns the success of unions, as I was suggesting yesterday, in defining the working week. So one of the great achievements of the labour movement was to say that the working week shall only be, you know, initially that was a big success when they got it down to 6.5 days, then they got it to 6 days, they got it to 5 days. I think in France they only work every other Monday. But the idea is that the unions want to restrict the working week. Okay? One of the really important achievements of labour unions was to restrict the working week, to say that it should only be 5 days, it should only be 40 hours, 9 to 5 and so forth. Well, digital technology has just thrown that out the window. It says you can talk all you want about restricting the working week, but from now on, you are 24/7 hooked into the system. Okay? So how do you develop union solidarity around that kind of technology? And it has really been difficult. Okay, so like in France, they passed legislation which enabled or empowered workers to say, at precisely 5 p.m. my working day is finished, email is off, I won't answer them until I get back into work at 9 o'clock the following day. Which sounds great, but I know for a certain fact that my boss would not take that same view. She would expect at 5:05, if there was an urgent email to be answered, that I would be answering it. And if I just said, look, I'm sorry, it's 5 o'clock, see ya, you know, we would be having a difficult conversation on Monday morning. So it's important to see that what digital technology is doing is not simply making our lives awesome. It is actually interacting and affecting a number of other avenues within our lives that over the past couple of centuries we've fought really, really hard to establish a set of protocols around what we mean by labour, what we mean by work, what we mean by a sort of fair contribution, and so on. So the psychoanalyst Teresa Brennan has called this bio-deregulation, the gap between the needs of the body and the needs of the market. And so increasingly what we've seen over the last 3 or 4 decades is that the needs of the market are given priority over the needs of the body. And in effect, the body is meant to adapt itself to the needs of the market, to the needs of the machine. That we are meant to, like, if, you know, as I was talking about yesterday, with the idea of the computer, that we sort of become a disabled person and just float around as a blob. You know, you might think that's desirable. I personally don't. But think about what it actually means. It's creating a work situation that is fundamentally bad for your body, because there's all kinds of research coming out now saying the single greatest problem of the 21st century is sedentariness. Doesn't matter how fat or thin you are, if you are active, you will be fine. But being inactive leads to X, Y, and Z, blah, 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 disease problems, etc., etc. Meanwhile, the workplace is geared ever more towards making you sedentary. So in other words, it's the capitalist model that wants you to be the blob floating around, not moving at all, just doing your work like that. Not you personally. You personally would absolutely probably love to get out there and be much more active. Which is why all the original fantasies of the mobile phone and the imagery of it was always about you out there doing something awesome. Like, you'd be on your bike, talking on the phone, quick, get a sell order through to your markets, or you'd be on your surfboard or something like that. But the reality is the absolute opposite. That it hasn't enabled people to be more active, it has led to them being far less active and to become virtually inert. That this is the position in which you kind of get stuck. Okay? So we are adapting our bodies to our machines, not our machines to our bodies, which kind of goes against the whole fantasy of technology. That technology is meant to make things better for our bodies, but in fact it's making them considerably worse. So culturally we value and we valorize the constantly engaged worker. They are our modern day heroes. I remember reading a John Grisham novel, which I have a bit of a guilty secret, but I hope you'll forgive me. But one of the really interesting things about his novels, which are otherwise not that interesting, is the way that he talks about all his characters as never sleeping. Like their real kind of heroic skill is the fact that they don't need as much sleep as everybody else. And my other guilty secret, you are too young to know who this is, but the Robert Ludlum novels. So the Robert Ludlum, so you know the Bourne Identity, right? So the Bourne Identity is Ludlum, but these were written in the 70s, updated for the 21st century. But in the 70s, the Ludlum characters all took methamphetamine, okay? And that was like par for the course. They don't sleep, they just take meth. And that was the secret, that was how they were able to be so heroic, is because they were basically meth addicts. Which somehow just kind of got washed out of the new movies. Maybe it was seen as being sort of in poor taste to be promoting meth in Hollywood movies, but nonetheless, the Ludlum characters were true meth heads. And bear in mind, the US Army invented meth precisely so that its soldiers could stay awake. So this was actually, its actual purpose. Okay, so what I'm suggesting then is this goes beyond a mere change in a work ethic. It's not really just another form of Protestantism. It's a change in subjectivity itself. Because it amounts to, or it calls upon us to think in terms of an eradication of alternate temporalities, unless, of course, it can be turned into an app. So mindfulness is okay, but only if you have an app for it. You need your phone to tell you how to be mindful. I guess it's sort of like some sort of mandala. You stare at your phone. Please make me less like the person who stares at their phone. But the very idea of mindfulness is quite interesting in itself. We have to see it as a cultural symptom. This is something that has only, fairly recently become quite popular within the West, and precisely at a moment when people feel that they have no time to do anything other than look at their screen. So mindfulness we could see as a kind of reaction formation to the 24/7 world in which we're expected to live in. Likewise, going for a walk is fine, but don't forget to put it on your step counter so that you know at the other side of it that you really nailed it. And as I said before, we even have apps to tell us if we sleep. Now, Walter Benjamin tried to describe something like this in the 1930s, and he used the word disenchantment. And he was talking about it as disenchantment because he says that the problem with contemporary society is that it no longer feels magical to us. It no longer feels like something that is really worthy of our belief and of our attention, and so we feel disenchanted. The remedy is re-enchantment. We as Deleuze says as well, we need reasons to believe in this world. Okay, and so if you think about the way by which digital technology is advertised to us, it is promoted as re-enchantment. Make the world magical. Okay, think about all the advertisements for iPhones and their apparently amazing cameras. Like, it's going to enable you to make the world amazing, but only if you take a photo of it. Okay, not by experiencing it, but by taking a photo of it, because it's going to look amazing in that picture, and when you put it on Facebook, everyone's going to be really jealous. So re-enchantment then comes to us in this sort of commodified form, but mediated via our devices. Okay? So the point I'm trying to get across then is that the way by which the device enters our world, it enters as a form of enchantment or as a form of re-enchantment, not simply a tool. It's not simply something that we use. It is part of the way by which we construct our world, part of the way by which we construct our belief in this world. So we've come to buy into the illusion that only that which is accessible actually exists. So accessibility, which is kind of like the flip side, if you like, of the idea of connected, means findable, it means discoverable on a computer, and it creates the illusion of permanence from the ephemeral. So think about it, when you're looking at your screen is just flickering light. Okay, that's really all it is. But nonetheless, we want to see that as a form of permanence. We take the photo and so on. So discoverable is a really interesting word. It's an absolute buzzword in universities. I don't know if that's true here, but certainly in Australia, in the US and the UK, discoverable is seen as being the holy grail. So in other words, when we got a new vice chancellor at my university, one of the first things that he kind of implemented was a new sort of strategy, a new regime, if you like, to make sure that every person who worked at the university as a researcher was more discoverable than they used to be. So what this means is that if you Google anything to do with, let's say, Deleuze, the first thing that should pop up is my name. Okay? From my university's perspective, that's what success looks like. To be discoverable. Okay? They're not interested in research that nobody has heard of, that no one cares about. They want research that is discoverable, that people can find, that people are finding, that people want to find, and so on. But you might ask, at what price, this discoverability? So as some of you may know, I wrote a dictionary of critical theory, which was a really interesting exercise. But for me, the most interesting aspect of that exercise was that in writing sections of it, I had to read the biographies of several important theorists through the past century. And one of the things that I began to notice was some of the really, really great philosophers and historians and so forth that we like to think about published basically nothing. Like in today's terms, they wouldn't even get tenure. Okay, so to give you an example, J.L. Austin, who basically created the concept of performativity, without which Judith Butler's work wouldn't be the way that it is, Deleuze and Guattari's work wouldn't be the way that it is. Guess how many publications he wrote in his entire lifetime, like his total lifetime, one of the most important linguistic theorists of the 20th century. Just random guess how many publications. Give me a number. 2. One of the single most important linguists of the 20th century, 2 publications. Now, if you were a graduate student, you just finished your PhD and you only had 2 publications and you applied for a job, what do you think? At my university, you wouldn't even make the short list. I mean, you wouldn't even make the long list. This is about how long your CV would get looked at. Like, we're talking seconds. Yep, 2 publications, not interested. They were 2 articles, not books, 2 articles. Like, at my university, they'd be looking 2 books. Okay, maybe we're going to talk to you. 2 articles, as if. So it's really, really interesting the way by which this discoverability, findability, and so on, and the sort of expectations placed on academia are that we value volume over quality, but more importantly, we have no real way of measuring quality except through findability. Okay, we look at citations as being a measure of quality, but we all know that it isn't. There's always that one paper that everybody really hates. It's got like 5,000 citations of people saying this is really shit. But from your university perspective, they're like, well done, you wrote this massively cited paper. But nobody looks at it and says, yeah, but every single citation says this is shit. So if it's just in terms of numbers, and that's our way by which we measure things, then we have obviously lost something really important. And so that's what I'm trying to get at, that the digital shift, not only does it mean that we find things, but it changes the way we measure things. Okay, Google, I don't know if you've read about the history of Google, But the way by which Google was invented was precisely through this idea that the number of times somebody looks at something must be an indication of its value and its worth. Okay, so the PageRank system on which the whole Google empire is built is premised on this idea that if people look at something more often than something else, that something must be better. And therefore, your search would want to find that thing before it found the other thing. Okay? So that means that Google as a source for finding information is really deeply flawed. Like, one of the first things I try to tell my students is don't use Google, because Google is heterogeneous in what it finds. For example, just type in a word like assemblage or assemblage theory and see what it throws up for you. Some 8,000 plus papers have been published with the term assemblage theory in the title, but they're completely different, you know, across a full spectrum. Like, assemblage means something quite different if you're talking to a geologist or if you're talking to somebody who studies fish. So I go cycling every morning with a marine biologist, and for him, assemblage means the total number of fish in a particular area. He's like, this is the assemblage. And I'm like, that's not an assemblage. What are you talking about? Haven't you read Deleuze? And so this Google doesn't tell you, okay? It's heterogeneous knowledge. But not only is it heterogeneous, it's also a kind of flat ontology. Everything is the same, okay? That doesn't make those kinds of crucial distinctions for us. So we need to think about the way by which digital technology is changing our perception of things, changing the way we value them, changing the way that we measure them, and changing ultimately the way that we encounter them. So accessibility, this idea of accessibility then cancels the periodicity of traditional life. So one of the other things that we could add to Ashish Nandi's talk yesterday is this idea of periodicity. So one of the things he didn't really mention was the idea of temporality, but in most accounts of village life and the idea of tradition and so forth, periodicity is absolutely fundamental, that there are seasons for planting, seasons for harvesting, and so on. So accessibility cancels the periodicity of traditional life, and it makes seasons seem like so many inconveniences rather than the subtle rhythms that have shaped humanity since the dawn of time. So nature, with its night and day, winter and summer, is constantly positioned as the enemy. Okay, so I remember a few years ago there was I read this article in a fashion magazine or something. I was doing reading a fashion magazine. I must have been in a waiting room or in an aeroplane and bored out of my brain or something. I don't know. But anyway, this particular article caught my eye because it was announcing the end of seasons, that there are no more seasons in fashion. In the sense that if you want to wear a sort of, you know, a clingy, strappy dress in the middle of a European winter, that's fine, you know, because they have heating, so what do you care? You don't need to wear winter clothes in winter anymore. You can go out wearing as flimsy a costume as you want to wear, regardless of the time of year, okay? Now, you know, in a sense that sounds kind of trivial, but think about what that actually means in the terms that Crary is putting it. No sense of seasonality. How do you then structure your year? There is no winter, there is no summer. You must always, you know, look this particular way. You must always function in this way. Perhaps a more serious example would be the notion of food. Okay, so food now is seen as being something that should be readily available all year round, regardless of seasonality. That if you want to have mangoes in the middle of winter, that's just fine, because, you know, somewhere in Peru they're growing mangoes all year round, and you can have your mangoes. You want to have avocados in the middle of winter, it doesn't matter, they're growing them in Mexico. They can be shipped to you. So our expectation or our encounter with food is no longer seasonally oriented. We don't even think about seasons anymore. We think about food being available all year round, all the time, 24/7. And so nature is positioned as the enemy. Okay? Now this is a really, really profound idea, because in order to make food available all year round, we have to fight against nature. So for example, in Britain, to have tomatoes all year round, you have to have hothouses. And if you're going to have a hothouse, that means you have to use fossil fuels to heat those hothouses and so forth. So at what price to the planet do we have seasonality? In order to have those avocados all year round, it means that they're using underground water in Mexico where water is in short supply, so that you sitting in your comfortable home in London can eat your avocado. So there is an enormous planetary, environmental and social cost to the end of seasons and to the idea that you should be able to eat whatever food you want, whenever you want, regardless of time of year, etc., etc. So technology, however, can overcome nature in all kinds of ways. And so Crary gives the example of the US military program called the Gorgon Stare, which is a vast surveillance operation that, as he puts it, is unblinking, irrespective of time or season. So implicit in this techno-surveillance is the denigration and ultimately the disintegration of the human abilities to see. We trust our machines more than we trust ourselves. And so in the age of megadata, and is the age of data and algorithms, they tell us who we are and what we are. And this is the reality of the people we describe as digital natives, as though they are somehow superior to us digital immigrants. I think that term is kind of false in lots of ways, but it is an interesting kind of a question to think about, for those of you that don't remember a time before mobile phones and don't remember a time before email, to sort of ask the question, well, what happened in that transition? What happened in that moment when there was, from when there was not something to when there was something? And I personally remember this moment quite well because I recall a conversation when I was a graduate student. This guy came, it was a bunch of us sitting around having coffee, and one of the lecturers came over and said, "I've got this really great news for you all." And we're like, "What is this great news?" And he said, "The Vice Chancellor has just given us permission to have computers in every office and for them to be connected to email." And, everybody was like, happy days, yay, life just got better. I reckon within about, 5 minutes, if they'd really thought about it, they would have realized, actually, no, things just got worse. Because from that moment on, you were accessible all the time. Prior to that moment, there was like one computer in the whole faculty office. And if you wanted to go and check your email, you could, but you had to sort of sit there with the faculty secretary staring at you like, why are you using that computer? And are you doing that for work purposes, or are you writing to your girlfriend? But suddenly now you had it in your office and you were accessible all the time. And not only that, the whole profession of being a secretary died in that moment. Because from then on, why did you get somebody else to write your letter? Because it didn't matter if you didn't know how to format it, because you were doing an email as well. So an entire profession died in that moment. And at the same time, academics then became multi-skilled in ways that they never had previously been multi-skilled. So if you asked yourself, and there's been all kinds of research on this, how much time do you spend writing emails that plausibly could have been done by a secretary, and how many books per year could you write extra if you didn't write those emails? It's a really serious question. Okay, it means that the academic time is, much less of that time is now devoted to research. And we're told, well, but look, you don't have to go to the library anymore because you can just look it up on Google, and so therefore you lose here, you gain there. But does anyone actually believe that? I don't know. But the reason why I think that the idea of being a digital native is kind of false, even though you may not remember a time before a particular piece of technology, for those of us who do remember that time, it's not like we were in a moment when there was no technology. So there's never been a time within the 21st century when we haven't, or the 20th century when we haven't been living with technology that was shaping our existence on a daily basis. What we've seen is an intensification of that, but there's no point in time where it just didn't exist. Even if you had a fixed phone in your house, you still had a phone. The mobile phone was a game changer for sure, but it was still basically the same technology, but now one that had become untethered from the world in which it was. But the digital natives, if you like, have inherited a landscape that has been stripped of many of the fundamental aspects that made our social world social. So when old people like me get nostalgic about the old days, one of the things that we're nostalgic for, apparently, is this idea of a different model of the social that existed paradoxically in the era before social media. So in other words, in our time then, the social has come to be synonymous with social media, okay? And so we stopped kind of asking the question, well, what does social really mean? Social media is now seen to be what social means. But is that really true? Is putting a like on Facebook the same thing as our model of society pre-Facebook? Is it the same thing as what being social meant 100 years ago in an Indian village? And I think the obvious answer is no, but what are the costs and the consequences of that shift? Okay. Now, the standard narrative about the idea of moving from the country to the city goes something like this, and I think Facebook intensifies this. In the country, everybody knew your business, right? So if you were having a secret affair with the person down the road, everybody kind of knew about it, and even if they didn't really talk about it, everybody knew about it. And if you had a secret sock fetish or something, everyone would know about it. But then you move to the city, and suddenly nobody knows who you are, and you can do whatever you want. You can go out with so and so, etc., etc. And on the one hand, that sounds really awesome. But then the minute we get to the city, we suddenly think, oh shit! But I really miss all that kind of close, convivial context of being in the country. So in a way, what Facebook and other forms of social media have tried to do is to say, well, you can live in the city and be as anonymous as you want, but because now you have your little social village on Facebook, you have all that sense of social connection that you lost when you moved from the village to the country. But the question would be, is it the same? And clearly it's not the same, which is not to say it's worse or anything like that, but it's not the same, it's different. How different is it? What have been the costs and the consequences of that change? So Crary also points to what he calls mandatory techniques of digital personalization and self-administration. So in other words, now that we're living in the big anonymous city, we have to figure out how to be someone and what being someone looks like. And clearly here, our profile on digital technology is a crucial aspect of that. But what he's saying is that this is a new form of what Foucault was calling the techniques of the self. So in other words, we could understand Facebook and the use of social media as a new generation of techniques of the self. These are the ways by which we construct ourselves, present ourselves, form ourselves for the world. And so to give you one example of how that operates, think about all the filters on phone cameras so that the picture that you take never has to look anything other than airbrushed perfect before you post it on Facebook or whatever form of social media that you use. But why does that even exist, if not as part of a technique of self-care and of self-management? Okay, it's wanting to project a particular kind of image of ourself, but not simply for some kind of vanity reason, but rather this is seen as what it means to be a person and a subject in this technical regime that we live in. Now, Crary wants to see these forms of digital personalization, as he calls it, as disempowering. I'm always suspicious of the term disempowering, but nonetheless, I think it's an important idea to work our way through. So anyone who cannot be integrated into this way of conceiving a subject is thus deemed, he says, as either surplus or expendable. In other words, what does it mean in 21st century life if you cannot have access to a computer, if you do not have, if you do not have a personal profile on a computer? Now, this idea of digital access and so forth has been researched quite a lot. I don't know if the research has been done here in India, but I suspect it is. But certainly within the UK, one of the things that the British government wanted to do was to move all forms of government onto the computer. So that healthcare, education, practically every service that you might want to get from government could only be accessed via a computer. Now, that sounds super convenient, etc., but for those people that do not have computers, do not have access to computers, don't have computer literacy, like I remember my dad saying to me, he was in his 80s, and he said to me, I think I might buy a computer. And I just laughed. I thought, I mean, what the hell would you do with a computer? Like, I could just imagine him turning it on, smashing at the keys, saying, and it would be a disaster. He was never ever going to be able to figure out how to use a computer. And so it was never ever going to be something that he could possibly do. So there is a cost to the convenience, that people become disenfranchised because they don't have access to this particular machine technology. And to give you a different kind of example, my daughter's social group, one of the girls in her group, for whatever mysterious reason, was not allowed to have a mobile phone at the same age as all the other girls were allowed to have a mobile phone. And this was seen as seriously socially disabling and alienating. Like, my God, you're 13, you should have a mobile phone already. How are we supposed to contact you? In fact, who are you? We don't even know you because you don't have a Facebook profile. So it's a real social issue, and it's obviously that's what's driving more and more people onto Facebook to get phones and so forth, because it's not just a matter of convenience. It's a matter of being able to participate in this thing that we call 21st century life. And so that's what we have to try to come to grips with as we're sort of trying to analyze digital technology. We're analyzing how is it shaping what 21st century looks like, not just as an order of convenience, but what it means to be a social subject today. So willingness, the ability to adapt to technology, rather than the other way around. As I said, we don't adapt technology to us, we adapt to technology, is becoming an increasingly prized cultural value. It's ratified in job specs, for example, like when you read an ad for a job, one of the key criteria is, can you use this particular kind of technology? Are you able to adapt to and keep up with the various updates this presents? So we are constantly being presented with new technological tools to better enable our integration with our machine existence. And these tools, how much better are they? Like, can you tell me that Word, whatever we're up to right now, is really significantly better than Word, whatever I'm still using, probably like Word 2010 or something? Like, if I still had my old laptop, which unfortunately died a horrible death, but if I still had that, the only app on the whole thing that I actually used was my Word app, right? Like, it had all these other amazing things like Excel spreadsheets. Who the fuck wants to use an Excel spreadsheet? Not me. I don't never even open the app. And if it had disappeared off my computer, I would never have known. And there was all these other amazing things and tools which I could never use. But in saying something like that, it's sort of like confessing that you are the son of Satan. You mean you don't know how to use an Excel spreadsheet? Horror. Like, my whole university, I'm sure that there's a goon squad that would come around and say, we're going to show you how to use Excel spreadsheet right now. Get ready for it. You're going to learn. So our sense by which we're meant to approach this technology is that you're not allowed to resist it, right? To say, I don't want to learn how to use Excel spreadsheet. I'm never going to use it. I don't care. Find someone else. That form of resistance is not tolerated within our sort of digital machinic universe. And I've seen very fine scholars within universities that I've worked at literally kind of getting the knock on the door saying, have you thought about retirement? More or less on the basis that they refuse to do email. Okay, and they're like, well, but it was never, I write these really amazing books. Why do I need email? But the university is like, you need email because that's basically what your job is. And if you work in a university now, like certainly in my case, if I come into work and the university server is down and you can't do email, I'm sort of like, I might as well go home. There's like no actual reason for me to be here. Like, my students don't come and see me; they send me emails. So it has become the dominant mode of interacting with people as well. And you can see this, I don't know if it's true here as well, but in Australia, for example, phone plans for teenagers more or less don't even worry about the idea that you're going to make any actual phone calls with them. What the crucial selling point is how much text you can send and how much data you can have so you can use for Facebook. Like calls, that people don't even make phone calls anymore. Like if your phone rings, you're like, why is it making this stupid noise? I wish it would stop. Who is this person trying to interrupt me? When they could just have, put it in a text or an email. So our mode of interaction is changing. Our expectations of how we want to interact with people is also changing. And so these tools, if you like, are organized as part of a larger process that Crary is calling self-administration, which sounds innocuous, but bear in mind the critiques by Adorno and so forth in the 1930s and 1940s, when they were critiquing Nazism, was to say that it was an administered society. So self-administration is like we have internalized the idea of the administered society, and now we don't see it as a bad thing anymore, we see it as a good thing. We are responsible for our self-administration. So the illusion of choice, he says, and autonomy is one of the foundations of this global system of auto-regulation. And so digital imagery, he says, is a lure to get us to spend more time in self-administration. So post a picture of your dinner on Facebook, and you are using your leisure time to validate a business. That restaurant is now gaining advantage from the fact that you took that photo. Self-administration also means self-observation. We are internalizing surveillance, as Foucault and Bentham predicted, with the concept of the panopticon. So Facebook solicits images that function in two ways, both as an enhanced technology of control and as a form of surplus value through their facial recognition software business, if you like. But also because like the pictures that we post are what solicit our attention to Facebook. And try this as an experiment. Take a picture of a tree and then take a picture of you smiling or doing something social, kissing your girlfriend or something like that, and see which gets the most likes. Now, it's not that people don't dislike trees. I mean, trees are awesome. But the Facebook algorithm prioritizes social events. So that picture will be seen by more of your friends than your picture of the tree. Okay? And so it constantly creates this illusion that there is a kind of value attached to the things that we do. Okay? And that social is valuable. So the most advanced forms of security surveillance technologies are now routinely used by marketing companies looking to uncover consumer behavior. So one of the most kind of pernicious of these is the idea of eye tracking software. So a lot of clothing companies, for example, now have eye tracking devices in their clothing shop. So as you walk into the shop, it can tell which things you looked at and how long you spent looking at it and whether you stopped or just kept walking. Okay? And it collects that data, aggregates that data, and it can tell you this is what people are looking at right now. This year, women are wearing fluffy skirts. We don't know why, but they are. So let's have more of them. Okay? Or this year, women wouldn't wear a fluffy skirt unless you paid them. So let's not have so many. Let's move on to whatever the next thing is. So eye tracking software is also used on packaging and boxes, so they can see which part of the packaging you stop and look at. Is your eye attracted by a particular color? Is it attracted by a particular kind of an image? So if you think about that, it's an amazingly powerful tool. But it also means that you're going to have massive, massive, massive standardization. Like novelty will gradually disappear because you wouldn't want to take the risk of using a color that people don't routinely look at. If it's well known that people look at black but not green, then why would you have anything green in your shop? Okay? So it leads to forms of standardization. And that's just only one form of tracking software. One of the other ones that's also used by the clothing industry is you can take like a body scan of yourself, and then you can go onto the website and it will tell you which clothes will fit you and which will look awesome and that kind of thing. But just think about how much data you are giving the company about yourself and in general, because everything that you do with that software they're recording. Okay? So our computers look at us looking at them in order to better understand how to make us see what they want us to see. So we are constantly told these technologies are here to stay, as though the future has already arrived or somehow been postponed. But this overlooks the actual human and environmental cost of this technology. So for example, Ashish Nandi yesterday was talking about suicides in rural India, which is obviously a completely appalling situation. But what we have to add to that terrible story is the fact that people working in factories and the Foxconn factories in China where the Apple products are made is notorious for this, also suicide at an appalling rate as well. So much so that the Foxconn factory in Shanghai has put nets around the base of the building so that you can no longer kill yourself by jumping off the roof. Okay, so you now land on this sort of trampoline net. So you're not allowed to kill yourself, I guess, because you would stop working. But again, the conditions are so horrible that it is driving this sort of suicide as well. One of the other things that we don't tend to think about, but think of the environmental cost, 10% of global power use is for machines on standby waiting to be used. Okay, so that's not being used, like your television is on constant standby. This device here is on constant standby. Nobody's using it, but it's still on anyway. So 10% of all electricity. So think of all the coal that's being burned for no actual reason other than the fact that we can't possibly wait, even a nanosecond for our machine to switch on, so it has to be on standby. So there is a sort of cost to our temporality, to our willingness to engage with a machine. We want it to be, more than instantaneous, but there is a real material cost to that. Our technology is marketed to us as delivering diversity, but as I've been suggesting, the reality is the absolute opposite. It has led to what Stiegler has called the homogenization of perceptual experience. If 2 billion people are looking at Facebook every 7 minutes of the day, that is a massive homogenization of perceptual experience. It means, what is that, nearly a third of the planet looking at the same thing all the time? That has never happened in history before. I don't even think you could ever say a third of the planet looked at the sky at the same time before. It's completely transformational. And I don't think we yet have the social theory that is able to come to grips with just how transformational that is. Okay? But this is a level of homogenization of experience unprecedented in history. Unprecedented in history, because it cuts across all the usual divides. It doesn't matter whether you're Muslim or Hindu or Christian or whatever, you're still doing the same thing. Okay? So whereas all previous forms of organizing of perceptual experience were organized, the most powerful form of organizing perceptual experience has always been religion. Okay? Religion organizes perceptual experience on a grand scale, but Facebook is doing something even more powerful because it's kind of making what you believe to be irrelevant to your experience. You will still keep looking at your phone, even if it's to look at an image of Krishna or whatever, you are still looking at your phone. Okay? So the dimension of change here is something that I think we're still not even close to beginning to understand. And so we could also look at the mass spectacle of the Olympics as a powerful example of the standardization of viewing. So the holy grail of television is for more people to be looking at less things. So as I said yesterday, if Facebook could figure out, Netflix could figure out how to have one program that the whole planet watched, it would. It doesn't produce diversity because it wants us to have, an enjoyable life watching Netflix. It produces that to try to capture our attention. If we don't like this show, we will watch that show. But if it could get away with just making one show, it would. Okay? So one of the other things that I'm trying to get to here then is this idea that we're sold on diversity, but what we actually get is standardization, what we actually get is homogenization. And it's kind of encapsulated in marketing in general, which is the best way to look at like an individual is to look like everybody else. Because you really individualize if you're wearing this year's fashion, which everybody else is wearing. And you can't be an individual unless you're doing what everybody else is doing. The fact that we don't see that as somehow ironic or nonsensical perhaps points to just how deeply captured we are by this model of marketing. But also it tells us that marketing is not simply an advertisement that we look at. Marketing isn't just one of the things that are happening around the peripheries of our life. Marketing is shaping our lives, and shaping our life in a really sort of profound way that we perhaps are not able to see. So one of the last thing I want to put to you from this particular topic before we move on to other things is this as an observation. So one of the really striking things about Deleuze and Guattari's work, and why I find it particularly interesting, is they want to talk about a process that they call schizophrenization. Okay. Now, although they don't put it like this, one of the things we might begin to think about is contemporary life is schizophrenic on multiple levels. Okay, in other words, the idea of schizophrenia, we've always thought of it as being a kind of a pathology, a psychiatric disorder. But if you think about its key criteria or its key symptoms, these are symptoms we experience in everyday life. So, for example, voices in our head. Now, you might think, I don't hear voices in my head. But just ask yourself this. As you're walking around and you see advertisements on your phone, you hear them on the radio, and so on, what are they if not voices in your head? Because all what schizophrenics say is, I hear a voice in my head and it's telling me to do something. But every single advertisement you look at is a voice in your head telling you to do something. Buy this if you buy that. Like, I was watching some TV this morning at the guest house, and I saw two advertisements. One was of some form of deodorant that men should wear, and I'm going to get some because I tell you, this guy put it on and instantly two women came over and they were like hugging him and dancing with him, and I was just like, this stuff is awesome, where do I get it? I'm just, sign me up. So I heard this voice in my head saying, you must buy this stuff. And then, you know, there was another advertisement where these women were putting on this magical cream and turning into white people. Why they wanted to do that is a mystery to me, but nonetheless, there was this voice compelling them to say, you must become a white person. And I think, you know, it's a quite shocking kind of a thing to see, and it's certainly something that, you know, you should be questioning. So we hear voices in our heads all the time, but we don't see that as being pathological. But try to imagine a time before advertising and a time before radio, okay, a time before television. It's not that long ago. 150 years ago, none of the technology that we are familiar with today existed, hadn't yet been thought of, except in the novels of crazy people. Okay, only crazy people thought that, you know, it would be possible to hear voices in your head all the time. But in the early 21st century, we have phones, we have headphones, we have voices in our head all the time, and we see that as being desirable. 150 years ago, if you said, I hear voices in my head, that's right, time to lock them up, put them in the basement. So the things that we used to define as a psychiatric disorder, we now see as highly desirable features of our daily life. So we have embraced schizophrenia not as an illness, but in fact as a desirable way to live, which means that we see people who are actually schizophrenic as we don't quite understand them, because, you know, why aren't they enjoying their life? Why do they feel persecuted by their symptoms, whereas we feel liberated by our symptoms? Now, obviously, I'm saying this to be provocative in lots of ways, but what I'm trying to get you to see is that the advent of this sort of marketing and commodification is not a kind of innocent thing. It has shaped our subjectivity. It's changed the way we understand the idea of the social. It has enormous cultural implications that go way beyond whether or not you like a particular TV program or whether or not you wear a certain kind of clothes or you use that amazing deodorant or not. It's shaping society. And I think what I'm trying to suggest then is that we need to defamiliarize our commodities, find a way of seeing them in an historical light, and ask the question, how did these things that we find to be such a normal part of our daily life get to become normal, when in fact, if we were to look at them in a kind of objective way, they are alarming and alienating and weird and strange, and we can't really understand why they actually exist. Okay, I think we'll take a break. We can take some questions, or we can have coffee then questions, or we can have questions and coffee at the same time. You know, this is modern life. You can do whatever you want. So long as you have an app for it, you can send your questions in on Facebook. I won't answer them, but you can. So I don't know, is the coffee ready, or should we do some questions now? I'm looking at you in India. You are the man in charge. So while he's finding out, I can take one question if anyone. Yeah, so you have a question over there? Yeah. I'll go there first and I'll come to you. Yeah.
So since so much of our experiences are digitized, what does that do to the materiality of anything, really? Because I was initially thinking about photographs.
Yep.
And it's not so much that the filters are a new thing.